What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to Clutch Talk. Episode 10, I believe, today, or episode 9, one of the two. And we're continuing our breakdown of every college football team this upcoming season, or as many as we can get through. And today it'll be Miami and South Carolina, two teams with somewhat high expectations. South Carolina does have high expectations. Miami looking to rebound from the season they had last year, losing Cam Ward, the number one overall draft pick. They brought in a lot of transfer talent. South Carolina got a lot of retention back, but they also have such a brutal schedule, so we'll get into that. And we'll get started here. If you like the video and are new, please subscribe to the channel. Will help a lot, and let's get started here today. Out of the two teams I want to start with Miami. A lot of transfer talent coming in, a completely new football team, basically what it was last year. Good year under Mario Cristobal. Disappointing end of the season. They were, 10-1. They were 1-1 away from the college football playoff, basically. And they lose to Syracuse at Syracuse. And they fortunately get left out of the college football playoff and then lose to Iowa State as well in the bowl game. They also lost at Georgia Tech, which was their first loss also late in the year in November, which kind of derailed the season they had this past year. A lot of it was to blame on the defense as well. The defense was not very good, particularly to end the year last year, and just kind of fizzled out. And they left a great opportunity on the field last year. And so they decided to go get the portal. They got a new defensive coordinator to hopefully revamp that defense to back to what the U used to be defensively. If we look at the offense, we're going to break it down. Starting with that offense. Again, the main story here is the quarterback that they brought out of the transfer portal, Carson Beck out of Georgia. As I said in my video about Georgia, I don't think Carson Beck was a primary problem to that offense last year. I think it was a combination of the offensive line and the run game that I think really derailed what he could have been last year. And I think a new fresh start at Miami will be very good for him. I think Shannon Dawson's one of the best offensive minds in the game currently, just what he did with Cam Ward last year. And I really trust Shannon Dawson with the hands of Carson Beck to revamp him and reset his mindset. I think it'll be good for Carson Beck this season. And then they went and got a new running back out of the portal from North Dakota State, and Shamar Brown had about 1,100 yards, 15 touchdowns last year. Extremely talented. He's coming from the FCS to the FBS, though. So that transition should be very interesting for him. But they're really excited about him over there. And then a brand new wide receiver room. It's a completely new wide receiver room from last year, headlined by C.J. Daniels, who's from LSU, transferred from LSU, had about 480 yards last year. A big fun target for Garrett Nussmeier, and now Carson Beck gets to throw the ball. They also went from Cincinnati and got Tony Johnson, who had 450 yards and 6 touchdowns last year. And then they also got a BYU wide receiver, Keelan Marion, who had 350 yards last year. So brand new wide receiver, as well as a new tight end from Tulane, Alex Bauman, had 171 yards, 6 touchdowns last year. He'll be a big-time target for Carson Beck. As we know, Carson Beck likes to throw the tight end based on what he did at Georgia. And then that offensive line has 4 returning starters, headlined by Francis Mauigoa, who's going to be a top 10 draft pick at the tackle position. Extremely talented. That offensive line, I think, is going to be very good this year. And then they went and got a center transfer from TCU, and James Brockermeyer, who's going to headline that center position on the offensive line. He's the only new addition, but again, like I said, everyone else is returning, which is a big deal for Miami. So that breaks down the offense. We'll get into the numbers later. But the main thing to me that I'm very interested to see is how the receiver room gels with Carson Beck. Because Carson Beck's from Georgia, and you got 3 transfers from 3 very different schools in that receiver room, and then obviously a new running back as well. The skill positions, I think, are going to be very interesting to see how they gel at their new home in Miami, especially when the expectation of Miami is just to win now. And it's hard. And for Carson Beck, I think his mindset has to be, I'm gonna be at Cam Ward's level. And if he can't be at Cam Ward's level, I think it'll also be very hard for Miami to hit what they were last year. But I really trust Shannon Dawson. I think Carson Beck's mindset's going to be in a completely different place, and it'll be good for him. As we transition over to the defense, this was a defense that really struggled at the end of the year last year. They gave up a lot of points. They were not good on third down. The secondary did not play well, and they were not good in the red zone. Didn't get a lot of stops. Did not get a lot of turnovers. A very struggling defense last year. But this defensive line, I kind of like the edge rushers they have. They return Akeem Messidor, 9 tackles for loss and 6 sacks, and Ruben Bain had 6 tackles for loss, 4 sacks. Ruben Bain did not have the year he had his freshman year last year, but I think he could go back to being that freshman level Ruben Bain with the expected increase in production. They did get a Louisiana Tech transfer, and David Blay, who I'm really, really high on, had 10 tackles for loss and 6 sacks last year. I think he's in for a big, big year. And he'll headline that interior of the defensive front. And then Ahmad Moten had 4 tackles for loss and 1 sack last year. I really like what he brings. He's a younger guy, but very talented. He's a 5-star out of high school. And then the linebacker room, Wesley Basante, 5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, 1 pass deflection and interception last year. And they went and got a transfer from NC State, and Kamal Bonner had 7 tackles for loss and a sack. So that headlines the front 7. This is what I really want to talk about, the secondary. They brought in a ton of transfers in the secondary. Ethan O'Connor had 8 pass deflections, 4 interceptions. He's from Washington State. They went and got Charles Brantley from Michigan State, had 7 pass deflections, 3 interceptions. The only starting secondary guy that they did keep was O.J. Frederick, had 6 pass deflections and interception. And in the safety positions, Zechariah Poyser from Jacksonville State had 3 tackles for loss, 8 pass deflections, 3 interceptions. And then they went from the spring portal and got Jacoby Thomas out of Tennessee, who had 3 tackles for loss and 2 pass deflections. He's more of a blitz safety, hard hitter safety. He's not the best in pass coverage, but he will be a hard hitter, and he'll be good for the blitz safety position. So that kind of has on the defense, again, a completely new secondary. If you notice, Miami has a lot of new, and that secondary is no exception. 4 of the 5 starters are transfers from previous schools. So that headlines the defense. And then if we look at the offensive numbers from last year, they were 3rd in passing, 31st in rushing, 1st total offense, 1st in scoring offense, 55th in sacks allowed. That was the only weak spot. But then they were 1st on 3rd down, 8th in the red zone. Again, to me, it just looked like a waste of opportunity from what that offense could have been last year. And I think it's going to be hard to be what that offense was last year. So I think the defense needs to take a step, because we look at the defensive numbers, 57th in passing, 19th in rushing, 27th in total, which isn't terrible. But then you look, they were 70th in scoring. 18th in sacks isn't terrible either, but 44th on 3rd down, 66th in the red zone. They got to be able to keep points off the board in order to let the offense, because the offense this year is not going to be 40 points per game like it was last year. I think Carson Beck's going to be better than what he was last year in Georgia, but I don't think he can hit 40 points a game, especially with the receiver room having a little bit of question marks because there's no true number 1 receiver. So I think the defense has to be better. I think the defense has to hit 35th or better this year if they want to succeed. Because you just can't be in these 52-45 games like they were with Louisville last year. I don't think you can win those games this year. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how that defense gels this year. But I do believe that the secondary will be better. The secondary will be better for Miami this year, and I think that will help their defense. I'm just very interested to see if they can get after the quarterback like they did last year. Now, looking at these record predictions, I think the worst for Miami is 7-5. I think that's the worst they can do, and that would be you lose to Notre Dame, you lose to Florida. I think you could lose at SMU. I think you can lose to Louisville, and then they lose at Virginia Tech. But the only way that would happen is if Carson Beck didn't get better from what he was at Georgia last year, and let's say the receiver room isn't very good. Let's say the defense doesn't get better at all. Let's say the defense is very bad this next year, or let's say the linebacker room doesn't turn out to be very good. All the things like if the defense stays 70th in scoring, let's say the offense takes a dip from 1st in total to 30th because Carson Beck just isn't the quarterback we thought he could be. 7-5 is very, very possible, but I do think the best is 11-1. If the defense improves and the offense stays top 20, I think 11-1 is very likely for Miami. And that would be, I think, the only game would be at Notre Dame at home, or potentially Florida, one of those two. But they get both of them at home too, which is a big deal. And I like the offensive line for Miami this year too. I think they could do some really good things. And 11-1 is a very possible scenario, and I think that would be the best. Most likely, though, I wanted to say 10-2, but I'm gonna say 9-3 because The team that went 10-2 last year for Miami had one of the best offenses in the last 5 years, or one of the top 5 offenses in the last 5 years. And I don't think they can hit that number this year. No matter, and I think the defense will be better, but I don't think it's better enough to be better than what they were last year. And I think, you lose to Notre Dame, you lose to Florida, and then you lose between the games of at SMU, Syracuse, at Virginia Tech, or even at Florida State. One of those they drop, because if you don't remember, Miami was also in a lot of close games last year, and I don't know how to feel about them being that much better than they were last year, particularly offensively, to be 10-2 like they were last year. And 9-3 would not be a bad year. It wouldn't get them in the playoff, but you win the bowl game, you have back-to-back 10-win seasons, you continue to build the momentum. Because people don't remember, Miami was in the dump for a long, long time. I think Mario Cristobal is doing a very good job at bringing the U back, but it's a slow rebuild, and I think that's what he's working on. And back-to-back 10-win seasons for Miami would be a big deal. And it just continues to build on the success, and they're recruiting really well right now. So 10-3 would not be a bad year, considering you lose a Heisman finalist and do just as good as you were last year. I really think that would be a good season for Miami. So that wraps it up for Miami. Again, halfway point of the video. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel. And we are going to move on to South Carolina. Probably the most polarizing team, one of the most polarizing teams in the SEC this upcoming season. And I say that because people are rating them very high and saying they're going to win 10 games, but their schedule is brutal. They start out with Virginia Tech. They go to Missouri. People aren't talking about Missouri, but they're not just going to fall from 10 wins to 4. They go to LSU. They play Oklahoma, Alabama. They go to Ole Miss. They go to Texas A&M, and they play Clemson to end the year. That's a brutal schedule. And they ended really hot. They were one of the hottest teams in the country to end the year last year. No doubt about that. However, I just think it's very hard to do what 9-4 last year with that brutal schedule. And they beat A&M at their place. I think A&M is better than they were last year. They beat Clemson. I don't see them beating Clemson again this year. And then, they beat Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a 10 times better team than they were last year, in my opinion. So looking at that, it's going to be very interesting to see what they look like. And they're such a wild card team to me, South Carolina's, and I'll show you why when I get into this roster. Obviously, looking at the offense, Lenore Stellers is the star. He was preseason first-team All-SEC. Had a crazy end of the year last year, played really well. 18 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, along with 650 yards rushing and 7 touchdowns on the ground. He's a magician, potentially. He makes some crazy plays. Now, he's still very new to being a quarterback, but all the talent's there, obviously. And then the new running back they got from Utah State, Rasul Faison, had 1,100 yards last year, 8 touchdowns. They think he could be better than what Rocket Sanders was last year, and if that's the case, that run game could take a huge, huge leap. The receiver, kind of similar to Miami, except all these receivers are retention. They're all coming back, and they were on the roster last year, but they're also very young and inexperienced. Mazio Bennett had 337 yards last year. And then Nick Harbor, 376 yards last year, 5 touchdowns. He's the one that people are really hoping and expecting to take the big jump. He's uber talented, 5-star out of high school, a track athlete, can absolutely fly on the football field, elite speed, but it's fitting him in the right position that I think people are really going to be talking about with him. And then they got Jared Brown, who had 244 yards last year. He's another young guy. But again, these are all Shane Beamer recruits, and they really think that Nick Harbor in particular can take the big jump. And I think he's going to need to in order for the South Carolina to meet the expectations that some people have for him this year. Tight end is going to be a transfer from Kentucky and Jordan Dingle. As we all know, Shane Beamer loves a tight end. He was a tight end coach background-wise, and he only had 71 yards at Kentucky, but he was there for a long time. Extremely good blocking tight end, which I think is going to be big, considering that the problem since Shane Beamer got to South Carolina has been the line of scrimmage. Getting a good blocking tight end, Jordan Dingle, is going to help. Speaking of that offensive line, both tackles are returning, which is a big deal. I don't think that's happened at South Carolina since Beamer's got there, so again, that's a big deal. Now the interior of the offensive line are all transfers. The right guards from Western Kentucky, left guards from Wake Forest, and the centers from Troy. They were all 3-star portal guys, so I'm very interested to see how that looks. But having the tackles back's good. I'm just very interested to see how the interior of the offensive line looks this year. Defense. This defensive front was really, really good last year. They lost a couple guys up front, the front seven, that I think will show early on, but they still have Dylan Stewart, who's going to be a sophomore this year. One of the best freshmen in college football last year, maybe the best freshman, along with Jeremiah Smith and Ryan Williams. Definitely the best freshman defensive player. He had 11 tackles for loss and 7 sacks last year. He's the leader of that defense this year. And they kept Brian Thomas on the edge, who's had 7 tackles for loss and 5 sacks. He also had a really good year. The interior of the defensive line's my question mark. They have Monkel Goodwin, who's going to be the starter now. 2 tackles for loss and a sack last year. And then they went into the portal and got Gabriel Brownlow-Dindy from Texas A&M. He did not play much at Texas A&M last year, struggled with injuries to stay on the field from time to time. So inexperience on the interior of the defensive line, I think, is going to be a question mark. And then the other question mark is the linebacker room. They lost a lot of guys. They got a transfer from Alabama, and Justin Okonkwo only had a tackle for loss recorded him. He didn't play much at Alabama. And then a guy who didn't play much at Florida State last year, and Sean Murphy, transferred from Florida State, had 2 tackles for loss last year. So the interior of the defensive line and the linebacker room is a question mark on the defense. And again, they were so good at those positions last year, I think it's going to be hard to replace. But again, Dylan Stewart's a monster. The secondary is what I really like about this defense this year. They returned Jalen Kilgore, who is, Shane Beamer said at SEC Media Day, is the leader of that secondary and one of the leaders on the team. He had 5 pass deflections, 5 interceptions last year. And then Judge Collier, the other corner, had 8 pass deflections last year. He's really good as well. And then I really like the nickel back that they got out of the portal from NC State, Brandon Sissy, had 2 tackles for loss and 5 pass deflections. Shane Beamer talked really highly about him. He's going to be the starting nickel. And they're really talking really high about him. And then DQ Smith, who's been there forever for South Carolina, had 3 pass deflections and an interception. Again, a guy that's been there a long, long time, 5 years, I think, now. Another leader along that defense, a very experienced guy who's played a lot of football in the secondary. And then Peyton Williams, the other safety, had 2 pass deflections last year. He's returning as well. So the defense, secondary-wise, I think it's going to be the strength compared to last year. Is all about the defensive front. I think the secondary could be the strength of this team, and then obviously Dylan Stewart's going to provide chaos on the edge. But there is question marks along that front seven, still losing the interior of the defensive line and then the linebacker room. But I still think the defense can be very good, just maybe not as good as it was last year. And looking at the numbers for both sides of the ball, I'm going to start with the offense. They were 75th in passing last year, right? They beat Clemson and they beat A&M, but they didn't necessarily throw for a lot. They didn't necessarily throw the ball a lot. They were, just trying to make it ugly, maybe make some explosive plays, and that's how they're going to win games. But they were 35th in rushing. I think that number could go up, actually. I think Lenore Sellers, they're going to run him more than they did last year and be more aggressive in running him. Rasul Faison, I think, is going to be, they say he's going to be better than Rocket Sanders, and I couldn't see why he couldn't be. And then 45th in total offense, and then 47th in scoring. I think that needs to go up. Because, again, I think the defense losing some of the guys they did last year, I think they need to take a step. And, again, people have Lenore Sellers first team All-SEC. I think they're expecting him to take the jump. And so I think that's going to need to happen. 120th in sacks allowed, though. That's what I'm talking about. The question has always been about that offensive line since Shane Beamer's got there. They really haven't made much improvement there. That's why I think the 3 interior offensive line transfers have need to make the biggest jump and make the biggest steps on the interior of the offensive line if they want to succeed. Because Lenore Sellers, he would leave games sometimes just from being hurt because he took so many hits. They got to protect him because he is the centerpiece of that football team. If he goes down, South Carolina's season is not what the expectations were. They're down, which is bad, and then 106 in the red zone, which is another bad stat. I think that part of that is the offensive line. Once you got to the goal line, they couldn't block on the inside zones, and they would try to go under center and do stuff that they just couldn't do because the offensive line couldn't hold up in the red zone. They got to be able to do that this year. This is year 5 under Shane Beamer. Every year it's been the question of the offensive line. It's got to take another step this year. Look at the defensive numbers, though. 44th in passing. I think that could go up. Just, again, retention along that secondary. Like I said, I've said it 1,000 times. Retention's so big in college football now. Getting retention, I think, is a huge, huge deal. 18th in rushing. Could be similar. I'm just very interested to see how the interior of the defensive line looks, like I've said. 16th in total, 12th in scoring, 6th in sacks. I don't think they can keep that up this year. I think the edge rushers will get a lot of pressure, but again, I think Dylan Stewart's going to be such an eye candy defensively, and they're going to be so focused on him that it's going to be hard for him to hit the level he did last year. I hope he does, and I think he could just because he's so talented. But they're going to have to be so focused on him. I think that's where the interior of the defensive line is going to have to take a step. 34th on third down, 20th red zone. Very good defense last year. If they can stay top 25, they could be just as good as they were last year. But again, that's the question mark. Can they? Before I get to these regular predictions, there's still just a lot of questions around the South Carolina team. They were so hot to end the year last year. People don't remember. South Carolina was 3-3 heading into the Oklahoma game, right? There's still just so many questions. Again, the teams that they're playing this year that maybe they beat last year really bad have improved, like Texas A&M, like Oklahoma, like Clemson, like those teams I mentioned. And now you have to go to LSU. Now you have to go to Ole Miss. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting just because their schedule's so different. That's why I think the worst they can do is 6-6. I think the worst they can do is 6-6. And that'd be you lose at Missouri, potentially you lose at LSU, Oklahoma, Alabama. You could lose at Ole Miss, at Texas A&M, or even Clemson. You could say the worst is 5-7, but I'm going to give them the edge over that Missouri game. But 6-6 is extremely possible, and that's the crazy thing. It's just because their schedule's so difficult. And I don't know how much I can trust the receivers in that offense to be a dynamic pass. And they don't need to be dynamic. Let me rephrase that. They just can't be 75th in passing and win a bunch of football games this year with their schedule. However, the best, though, will be 10-2. And to me, that would be, you lose to Clemson and at LSU. Let's say you go into, or let's say you beat Clemson and you lose at Kyle Field and all that stuff. 10-2, I think, would be the best case scenario, just because I don't think they can do much better with their schedule. But that would have to also entail the linebacker room and defensive front. It ends up being just as good as it was last year, and then Lenore Sellers takes the jump that people think he can. I mean, people have him preseason first-team All-SEC over Garrett Nussmeier, over Arch Manning, over John Mateer, over all these guys, over DJ Lagway. I mean, they are really, really high on him this year, and so if he can take that jump, 10-2 is very likely, and that would get South Carolina in the college football playoff without question. With that being said, though, I think the most likely is 8-4, and I put 8-4/7-5 because, I mean, I don't think they can beat Clemson this year. I don't think they can go into Kyle Field and win a game. I don't think they can beat Alabama. I don't think they can beat LSU, and that would leave me with 4, right? And now I'm giving them the edge, let's say, over Oklahoma at home, and then you go to Ole Miss and win. But that's why I have to slash 7-5, because I think they could lose one of those two games as well. So 8-4/7-5 is the most likely. And there's so many teams in the SEC that are in that group too. I saw Cole Kubel talking about this. It's like you have A&M, you got Florida, South Carolina, Ole Miss, Oklahoma, all in that like that tier 2, and one of them is going to take a step back. And I think South Carolina is one of those teams I think will take a step back. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Let's say they do go 8-4 in the bowl game. It's 9-4. It's not really a step back. But with that schedule, man, and teams that actually I think got better than South Carolina. I think Oklahoma got better than South Carolina did last year, or did more to get better. A&M, same thing. So 8-4/7-5, I think is most likely. 7-5, I'm starting to lean towards, which would be a step back. But again, regarding the schedule and all that, and if the games are competitive, I don't think people are going to bat an eye saying, "Oh, South Carolina, Shane Beamer may not be the guy," or Lorna Sellers is a flop. If they lose in competitive fashion, no, I don't think it was a flop season at all. But if they do, let's say LSU blows them out, Alabama blows them out, Clemson blows them out, then maybe it was a disappointing season. But I think if they play all those games competitively, let's say some of them go down the last drive, and they just happen to go 7-5, you just can't say it's a flop season just because I think the schedule they had to work around was so tough. Similar to Florida's. Florida's got a really tough schedule too, but I honestly would consider saying South Carolina has a harder schedule. I would consider that at least. But with that being said, I'll wrap that up, and that'll also wrap up our video. Next video, I'm going to be breaking down Illinois and Alabama. Illinois is returning a lot, and I love retention. I think it's a big deal this year in college football, and they're returning a lot of guys, and their schedule is very workable. And they had a really good year last year under Brett Bielema, and I think they could have another really big one this year. And then Alabama, who under year one under Kalen DeBoer, things did not go according to plan, but that defense could be really good. And then Ty Simpson's projected to be the starter. I think he can do some really good things this year. The receiver room's going to be really good. Offensive line's going to be really good. So we'll break those two down next. And yeah, thank you all for watching. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Peace.